On an ordinary day, Clara sees a homeless man counting coins to buy a coffee. So, she decides to buy him something to eat, without knowing that he was about to commit a tragedy. As Clara discovers the true story of the man who once seemed like a simple beggar, she begins to cry without stopping. Clara used to frequent that simple cafe on the mornings before busy days. She always sat at the same table near the window, overlooking the street. As he drank his coffee, there was a calmness to that routine. The aroma of hot coffee surrounded her, and the muffled noises in the room gave her time to think and reflect on life and the responsibilities that always seemed to pile up. She was young, with a calm look, but she carried with her a constant concern for the world around her. He was a person who just observed suffering. She felt the impact of others' pain on herself. Perhaps it was this sensitivity that made her so attentive to the small details of everyday life and gestures that went unnoticed by most. That morning, like so many others, Clara stared at the street through the window, observing the flow of hurried people. But suddenly, something broke his tranquility. His eyes fell on a homeless man across the street. He crouched down, trying to collect some coins that had fallen from his pocket, moving with a slowness that Clara could only associate with exhaustion. His hunched posture and careful, almost hesitant movements indicated that he didn't have the strength for something as simple as picking up coins from the floor. All around, people continued to rush by, completely ignoring him, as if he were invisible. Clara watched that scene with a heavy heart. There was something deeply painful about the way the man moved. It wasn't just the action of picking up the coins. That's what the scene represented. He seemed to have carried the weight of the world on his shoulders for too long. The sadness on his face was evident, but there was also something else. A silent defeat hung over him, as if he had given up expecting any kind of kindness from the world around him. She remained there motionless for a few moments, feeling a mix of anguish and empathy. The man slowly stood up, still counting the coins in his shaking hand, and began walking towards the cafe. His every step seemed to weigh a ton, and his presence filled the space around him with a palpable melancholy. As he approached, Clara felt her body react. Something inside her, perhaps an impulse that had always been there, perhaps a calling to do what was right. It began to take shape without needing to reflect much. She realized she couldn't ignore it. The sight of that man and the pain he carried awakened something that prompted her to act, driven by her supportive nature. She didn't know what the impact of what she was about to do would be, but she needed to follow that instinct, an impulse of compassion that was characteristic. When he entered the cafe, the ambience seemed obvious. Customers were immersed in their routines, some hustling with their smartphones, others focused on their conversations, all ignoring the worn-out figure who had just walked through the door. However, Clara watched him closely. She watched as he approached the counter with hesitant steps, as if each movement was carefully calculated so as not to attract attention. His trembling fingers held the coins, and he counted them one by one with an expression as if he didn't know if he would have enough. Clara realized that this was not the first time he had found himself in this situation, and something inside her revolted at the idea that someone could be so alone and helpless. Her heart sank at the scene, feeling as if his pain was somehow hers too. Without thinking twice, she made the decision that had been bubbling in her mind since she saw him through the window. Clara got up from her seat and approached him, lightly touching his shoulder. He turned around in surprise, as if he hadn't expected someone to address him in a friendly manner. "Can I buy you a coffee and a sandwich?" asked Clara with a welcoming smile. The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes full of distrust but also hunger. I don't want to bother you," he replied, his voice almost fading. "It's not a bother at all," Clara said softly. "Please accept. I want to help you." Those simple moments of dialogue carried a kindness he wasn't used to encountering. He looked at the coins in his hands, then at Clara, and finally his eyes sparkled, albeit with timid suspicion. Clara's offer was unexpected, but hunger spoke louder than any fear. "Thank you," he murmured, a little embarrassed but genuinely relieved. "Thank you really," Clara added. She smiled and motioned for him to sit down while she went to get the coffee and sandwich. The man, for a moment, felt that the weight of his day had become a little lighter and, for the first time in a long time, a thread of hope sprouted in his heart. When Clara returned with the sandwich and coffee, she noticed that Marcelo seemed less suspicious, but still carried a certain fear. She handed him the food with a smile, sat in front of him trying to create an atmosphere of comfort. "What is your name?" Clara asked in the lightest tone she could manage. She was dealing with someone who probably hadn't trusted people in a long time, so her goal was to convey empathy. Marcelo looked at her for a few seconds, as if he was weighing the decision of whether to open up or not. "My name is Marcelo," he finally replied, his voice low but clear. Clara nodded, grateful for his willingness to talk. "It's a pleasure to meet you," said Marcelo sincerely, as he watched the first bite of the sandwich. For someone in her situation, it wasn't just a matter of physical hunger, but also of carrying a heavy emotional burden. For a few moments, silence was present, broken only by the sound of people moving chairs and Marcelo's silent bites. Clara wanted him to feel comfortable talking, so she asked simple questions without forcing him to open up. "Are you from here in Sao Paulo?" she asked. Marcelo looked at the coffee on the table as if the question had awakened something in his memory. "Yes," he replied, almost in a whisper. "I was born and raised here, but I never came home." Clara leaned forward a little, showing genuine interest in hearing more. "Why did you leave?" she asked carefully, not wanting to invade her privacy too much, but willing to understand her story. Marcelo paused, his eyes distant. "My house wasn't a good place," he began, his voice becoming more choked with each word. "My father was violent. He fought with my mother all the time. There was screaming, hitting, and she suffered, but she couldn't get out of that situation. When I was little, I hid under the bed, waiting for everything to be over." Clara listened in silence, but inside she felt her heart tighten with each word. Marcelo's story revealed a pain she could barely imagine. The domestic violence he had witnessed was not something that was forgotten over time, and Marcelo carried the scars of that past. "I couldn't take the blows any longer," he continued with teary eyes. "When I turned 15, I ran away from that. I didn't know where to go, I just wanted to get out of there. I thought that if I stayed, I would end up becoming my father, and that was the worst thing I could imagine." Clara felt a lump in her throat when she heard this. Marcelo, despite everything, had resisted. He had fled, not to escape a responsibility, but to save himself from a fate he feared. With each sentence that Marcelo said, Clara felt the weight of the pain he carried, but she also recognized the invisible force that kept him standing. "It must have been very difficult," she said in a soft voice, trying to demonstrate that she understood him, even though she had never experienced anything similar. Marcelo just nodded, staring at his coffee. It was evident that there was much more to his story to be told, and Clara, with patience and empathy, waited for the right moment so that he felt comfortable enough to continue listening. Listening was sometimes the greatest gesture of compassion she could offer. Marcelo looked at the coffee in front of him, as if trying to find the right words to describe the pain he had carried for so long. Clara continued to watch him in silence, feeling that he was about to reveal more of his experiences, and she didn't want to interrupt the flow of her thoughts. "After I ran away from home," he began in a low voice, "I thought life on the streets would be temporary. I believed that, at some point, I would find a solution, a job, anything that would get me out of that situation. But it wasn't like that." He paused, his eyes wandering around the room, as if the memories were too painful to be relived all at once. At first, I had hopes. I knocked on doors, tried to present myself in the best way possible, but no one wanted to give me a chance. No matter how many times I explained my situation, I always saw that look, a look that judged me before I even opened my mouth. Containing the sadness she felt upon hearing Marcelo's story, Clara bit her lip. She knew the cruelty of first impressions, but hearing him talk about the reality of those who live on the margins of society hit her viscerally. She could see in his eyes the weight of the doors that closed, one by one, leaving him increasingly isolated. People only look at my appearance, he continued with a palpable bitterness in his voice. They don't see who I really am. It's as if being on the streets is the only thing that matters. They think I'm dangerous. They think I'm in this situation because I deserve it. Marcelo's words were like invisible blades cutting through Clara's heart. She felt the injustice in his voice, as if every rejection, every look of contempt, was etched deep into her soul. He had been condemned by a society that refused to look beyond the surface and ignored his humanity. The worst thing is not hunger or the cold, he said with his eyes fixed on the ground. What really hurts is loneliness. Nobody approaches me, everyone seems afraid, and after a while you start to disbelieve that maybe you really are invisible, that you no longer have a place in the world. Clara took a deep breath, trying to keep control of her emotions. Marcelo's vulnerability moved her deeply. It was difficult to imagine how he had endured all that without giving up. She felt that he still carried a strength, even if he himself didn't recognize it. "I understand," she said with a trembling voice, trying to find the right words to comfort him. "But you're not invisible, Marcelo. I'm here and I care." Marcelo's eyes met hers and, for a brief moment, he looked surprised. It was as if he wasn't used to hearing that someone truly cared about him, and Clara's sincerity touched him in a way he hadn't expected. "Thank you," he murmured, almost voicelessly, as if those words were difficult to pronounce after so long in silence. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Clara replied, holding back her own tears. "Just know that you are not alone. There are people who see you beyond what is on the outside." As they continued talking, Marcelo paused as if he was gathering the courage to share something more intimate. His eyes, previously overshadowed by tiredness and sadness, gained a different shine, like a soft light of longing. Clara noticed the sudden contrast and waited patiently. After a few seconds, Marcelo began to speak, his voice soft and somewhat choked. "I had a best friend on the streets. My dog, his name was Tobias," he said with a small nostalgic smile that softened the lines on his face. "He was always by my side, even in the worst moments." Clara felt a change in Marcelo's tone when talking about Tobias. Something new emerged, like a feeling of tenderness and affection that he hadn't shown before. It was as if, when remembering the dog, Marcelo was connecting to a part of himself that still knew what love was. "I found him right after I ended up on the streets," continued Marcelo. "He was just a puppy, alone like me. I think on some level we both knew we needed each other." He gave a soft laugh that seemed to bring relief, as if the happy memories of time with Tobias were a relief from the wounds he carried on the worst days. "When I didn't have anything to eat, Tobias would be there by my side, looking at me as if to say, 'We're in this together.'" Marcelo's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of contained pain. Clara felt the air heavy again, but this time it wasn't the silence of loss. "He was the only thing that kept me standing," said Marcelo, his voice low and trembling. "In moments when I thought there was no more hope, Tobias reminded me that I still had something to fight for. I took care of him, and somehow that gave me a purpose." Clara watched, absorbing every word and gesture. It was easy to imagine how Tobias had helped Marcelo survive, not just physically but emotionally, offering companionship and a kind of silent comfort that humans were often unable to provide. But he trailed off. He's gone. I'm so sorry for your loss, Clara said, her voice soft but full of compassion. Tobias seemed very special. Marcelo looked at her, surprised by the gesture, and for a moment it seemed like something inside him softened. He was the best friend I ever had, he replied, with a sparkle in his eyes. And, as difficult as life was, he made it a little less lonely. Clara remained silent, knowing that sometimes just being present was the greatest comfort she could offer. Then, Marcelo took a long pause, as if gathering the courage to address the most painful topic of his life. He looked at the table, taking a deep breath, and Clara noticed that his hands were shaking slightly. The words he was about to say hung heavy in the air, and she knew instinctively that the next chapter of her story carried a pain even deeper than anything he had already revealed. I think the worst part of all has begun, said Marcelo, his voice a little hoarse. It was losing my mother. He raised his eyes for a brief moment, meeting Clara's before looking away again, as if he wasn't yet ready to fully face the raw emotion he felt. Clara felt her heart tighten, knowing this was the breaking point for him. She watched him struggle to maintain his composure as the weight of that memory seemed to suffocate him. She was the only person I had. After running away from home, I lost contact with her. I tried everything to find her again, but I couldn't. Just a few months later, I found out she had died. The pain was palpable in every word Marcelo said. He paused for a moment, clasping his hands as if trying to contain the emotions that now threatened to boil over. Clara remained silent, offering the only thing she could at that moment: her undivided attention and compassionate presence. She died and I never had the chance to say goodbye, he said, his voice almost breaking. When I found out, it was too late. I couldn't say goodbye. I couldn't say that I loved her, that I was so sorry for not being able to be by her side. Marcelo's words fell like heavy stones and were full of regret. He fell silent, fighting back the tears that were now pooling in his eyes. Clara felt his pain reverberate within herself. It was a pain of loss, but also of guilt. The guilt of not having been able to do more and of not having been there in her mother's final moments. Unable to hold back her own tears, Clara felt a single drop slide silently down her cheek. She couldn't imagine the depth of this wound in Marcelo, but she could feel the intensity of the suffering he carried. The loss of his mother had left an insurmountable hole, something he had never been able to fully overcome, and she knew he was trapped in this cycle of grief, struggling in vain to find a way to escape. She was everything to me, continued Marcelo, his voice soft, firmer. My mother raised me almost alone while I was beaten by my father. She did the best she could in the midst of that chaos. She was strong, you know? Even with all the pain, with all the violence, she never gave up on me. Clara discreetly wiped away her tears, trying to remain calm as she listened to him. At the same time, she felt helpless. I wanted to do more than just listen, but I didn't know how. His pain was so great, so deep, that a simple act of kindness didn't seem enough to remedy all the suffering he had accumulated over the years. I just wish, Marcelo said, his voice breaking once and for all. I wish I had the chance to tell her that everything was going to be okay. I just wish I had the chance to tell her everything was going to be okay. I couldn't do that, he continued, and now she's gone and I've lived alone half my life. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. The weight of Marcelo's words was devastating, and the only thing she could do at that moment was reach out and lightly touch his arm, offering a gesture of comfort. You're not alone now, she said, her voice soft but firm. Marcelo looked at her, his eyes red from holding back the tears, but something in Clara's expression seemed to break the last barrier that prevented him from allowing himself to feel the tears he had been fighting to contain. Finally, they fell silently, marking their faces tired and aged by suffering. As the conversation progressed, Marcelo seemed to give up his defenses, exposing layers of his pain that perhaps he didn't even know he still carried. Clara felt that every word he spoke was filled with deep anguish, as if the sadness he held inside was finally being released. She kept her gaze fixed on him, paying attention to every detail, every pause between sentences, knowing that for someone like Marcelo to be heard was an act of courage and vulnerability. "Sometimes," said Marcelo in a lower, broken voice, "it seems like the pain is unbearable, that I have no way out." He looked down, embarrassed, as if confessing that was a weight he never wanted to share. "I thought several times that maybe the best thing would be to end everything, just stop feeling this pain." His words fell like a bomb in Clara's heart. The air around her seemed to have grown heavier, and she felt an invisible punch in her stomach. Those words spoken so casually revealed the depth of despair that Marcelo had faced on the streets, alone, with no one to support him. The idea that he, in his suffering, considered taking his own life was devastating. The pain was so intense that for him, the only way out seemed to be the end of everything. "Sometimes you think you have no one, that you don't have to continue," he continued, with the words coming out slowly, as if each one represented a piece of his soul. "I looked at the people around me, living their lives, and I asked myself, why do I have to go through this?" Clara wanted to say something, anything to ease that weight, but she felt paralyzed for a moment. She needed to be careful, as every word said from now on must be loaded with meaning. "I was on the edge of an emotional abyss. I know it's hard to believe right now, but there's a reason you're still here, even in the darkness. There is always a light. Sometimes it is hidden, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist," said Marcelo in a soft, firmer voice. Marcelo looked at her with a face full of skepticism, but also with a hint of hope, as if he wanted to believe, but didn't know how. Clara, that he was looking for something to hold on to, even if it was a fragile thread. "I don't know," said Marcelo. "Did all this happen to you?" "No," Clara replied, leaning forward a little, with her eyes fixed on his. "But I know that you are important, that your life has value. Don't give up on yourself, please don't give up." Clara's words were soft but firm, as if she was putting the full weight of hope into each syllable. Clara knew that those words might not be enough to erase all the pain that Marcelo had accumulated over the years, but she hoped that, somehow, they could plant a seed of hope, even if small, for a moment. Marcelo didn't say anything and just looked at Clara, as if trying to process what he had just heard. "I wasn't used to this kind of kindness. The idea that his life had value and that he was important to someone, even a stranger, seemed unrealistic, almost unattainable." "Do you really think that?" he asked in a low, hesitant voice. It's as if he needed confirmation that this wasn't just a passing kindness. "I'm sure of that," Clara replied with conviction. "You deserve to live, and, more than that, you deserve to find something good in this world." Marcelo took a deep breath, as if those words had awakened something inside him that he hadn't recognized for a long time. Clara could tell by the look in his eyes that something had changed. He was still hurt, there was still a lot of pain to process, but her words reached him on a deep level. Suddenly, Clara realized that her time was running out. The clock on the wall indicated that she couldn't be late for work any longer. But how could she leave him there in that state, knowing that he was carrying so much suffering? She stood up slowly, knowing she needed to leave, but not wanting to leave Marcelo without a last word of comfort. "I need to go to work now," she said sadly, "but know that you are not alone and that I believe in you." Before leaving, she made a point of looking Marcelo in the eyes one last time and reinforcing, You are important and your life has value. Don't give up on yourself." These words echoed inside Marcelo, who seemed surprised by the sincerity and intensity of those words. For him, that simple act of listening and paying attention had been a gift he would never forget. With teary eyes, Marcelo seemed to hesitate for a moment. Then, with a look that mixed gratitude and emotion, he asked Clara to wait just a moment. "Wait, Clara," he said in a trembling voice. Clara watched him as he slowly stood up, as if that gesture carried more meaning than she could understand at the moment. He walked up to the coffee counter, discreetly asking the attendant for a piece of paper and a pencil. Clara remained seated, intrigued by what he was about to do. Her heart beat a little faster and a wave of anxiety, mixed with curiosity, took over her body. She couldn't imagine what Marcelo had in mind. After everything they had talked about, every word, every emotion shared, had been so intense that she could barely process what came next. What could he be writing? A thought of gratitude? A reflection on what they had discussed? Clara's mind wandered between these possibilities as she watched him from afar, sitting at the counter, focused on writing. Across the cafe, Marcelo was scribbling on the piece of paper carefully, his handwriting irregular and hurried, revealing the urgency of his emotions. The attendant looked at him from the corner of his eye, but didn't ask any questions. It seemed like he understood the importance of that moment for Marcelo, perhaps just by the expression on his face. Clara continued to watch him from her desk, and time passed slowly, anxious to get to work. She could feel the depth of Marcelo's gesture, although she still didn't know what he was preparing. The atmosphere around them seemed almost suspended, as if the world outside had stopped for a moment to make way for what was to come. Shortly afterwards, Marcelo returned. His steps were firmer now, but there was still a certain vulnerability in his movements. He stopped in front of Clara, holding a small piece of paper between his fingers, looking shy and humble. "I just wanted to give you this," he said, extending his hand, still not fully understanding what was happening. Clara took the paper, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingers. She looked at Marcelo, who was watching her with a mixture of nervousness and expectation. There was something in his gaze, something that made her realize that that piece of paper wasn't just a simple note. It was something much deeper, loaded with meaning. Clara opened the small piece of paper carefully. The heart was beating faster than normal. As soon as her eyes swept over the irregularly written words, she felt her entire body shudder for a brief moment. She couldn't believe what she was reading. The words that Marcelo had chosen, apparently simple, carried a deep and devastating meaning. "Today I thought about putting an end to everything, but thanks to you I don't want to do that anymore. Thank you, wonderful person." The veiled message was clear to Clara, and its impact was immediate. The realization of the depth of that note hit her like a wave, taking all her composure with it. The tears began to stream down her face before she could stop them, silent and uncontrollable. Clara felt a tightness in her chest, as if the world around her had stopped. The pain, loneliness, and despair that Marcelo carried with him were condensed in that note. Clara, still holding the paper in her trembling hands, looked at Marcelo, who was watching her from afar, with a mixture of shyness and hope. He didn't need to say anything else. The gesture and writing were there, revealing that the meeting between them had been more than an exchange of words. She didn't just listen to his story. She changed her trajectory, if only for a brief moment. The simple act of paying attention and treating Marcelo with dignity had illuminated a part of his life that he had previously considered irretrievably erased. Clara tried to wipe her tears with her coat sleeve, but they continued to flow. She was deeply touched. Marcelo was on the edge of the abyss, and that coffee, that conversation, represented the hand that pulled him back to life. She thought about what would have happened if she had just gone about her day, without looking out the window, without caring about the man trying to collect coins. The idea that Marcelo could have made another, much more tragic decision weighed on his heart. At the same time, she felt a wave of relief knowing that, at least on that day, Marcelo found a reason not to give up. It was something she would never forget. With the note still in hand, Clara slowly stood up. His mind was confused, taken by so many different emotions, but there was a certainty that accompanied it. Marcelo now knew that his life had value, that someone somewhere saw him as more than just a homeless man smiling. Through her tears, she looked at Marcelo one last time. "Thank you for letting me be part of your story," she said in a shaky voice, but full of sincerity. Marcelo returned the smile shyly, but there was a new sparkle in his eyes, a flame of hope that Clara knew hadn't existed before that morning. When she finally said goodbye to Marcelo and left the cafe, Clara felt the weight of her emotions, but also an unexpected lightness. She had made a difference in someone's life, and it transformed her too. Throughout the workday, Clara could barely concentrate on her tasks. Marcelo's words echoed in his mind, and the note he had given him seemed engraved in his memory. She thought over and over about the encounter they had, the impact of that simple conversation, and how genuine kindness could save a life. She felt overcome with a mix of emotions: gratitude, empathy, and a growing need to do more. The experience had awakened something deep in her, something she couldn't ignore. As he reviewed documents in the office, his mind wandered back to that morning at the cafe. Every word from Marcelo, every look of pain mixed with hope, was engraved in his heart. The idea that a simple conversation, a sandwich, and a coffee could have been what made the difference between life and death for someone was both crushing and powerful. Clara knew she couldn't let that get lost in the anonymity of her daily life. Marcelo's story needed to be told, not for his own satisfaction, but so that others would understand the power of an act of compassion. On the way home, the same thought accompanied her like a constant companion. She looked at the people around her, busy with their routines, and wondered how many of them had already gone through difficult times, invisible to the eyes of others. It was a harsh reality that often went unnoticed, and Clara felt she needed to do something to illuminate this darkness. With her mind made up, she sat down that night in front of her computer, ready to share her experience on social media. Clara spent a few minutes thinking about how to start. He wanted his words to carry the same depth and emotion he felt in that cafe. Taking a deep breath, he started typing. "Today I had an experience that changed my perspective on life. On an ordinary morning, while drinking coffee, something extraordinary happened. I met Marcelo, a man who in just a few minutes showed me that a simple act of compassion can lift someone from the brink of despair, invisible to the world around them. But one conversation changed everything. Often, all we need is someone who sees beyond appearances and offers a little empathy in the midst of indifference." With each sentence she wrote, Clara felt a sense of relief. She was finally sharing the experience that had touched her so deeply. "We don't know what others are facing," she continued, "but what I learned today is that small actions can have an impact we never imagined. It doesn't take much to change someone's day or even life." When I finished the text, Clara felt a lightness in her heart. She reviewed the words once again, making sure they conveyed exactly what she wanted: the importance of energizing others and reaching out, even in a simple way, without hesitation. He clicked publish, and within minutes, the post started gaining attention. Initially, close friends commented with messages of support, admiring her compassion and sharing words of encouragement. But quickly, the post began to reach a much larger audience. Comments from strangers poured in, and people shared their own stories of empathy, times when they had been touched by unexpected acts of kindness or offered help to those in distress. Some people wrote about how they had been through similar times to Marcelo, living in despair, and how small gestures from others had helped them move forward. Clara watched the repercussion of the post with a warm heart. She never expected her story to touch so many people, and seeing how her story was inspiring others to reflect on their own attitudes made her realize the true scope of what had happened that morning. It wasn't just about her and Marcelo, it was about something bigger, a chain of compassion that could spread and transform lives. As she saw the number of comments grow, Clara felt connected to something much bigger. Marcelo's story now belonged to all those who were willing to look beyond appearances, to see the pain of others and offer a light, no matter how small. She smiled contentedly, knowing that the impact of that encounter would continue to resonate for a long time. However, the repercussion of Clara's post continued to exceed any expectations she might have had. In a matter of days, the text had spread to different corners of the city and even beyond, touching people from different backgrounds and life stories. The impact that Marcelo's story had on Clara was now being felt by thousands of others, creating a wave of solidarity that she could never have imagined. One of the many stories that caught Clara's attention was that of a woman named Anna. She commented that, inspired by Clara's post, she had decided to offer help to a man who lived in a square near her home. "I always saw him there every day, but I never had the courage to approach him," wrote Anna. "After reading his story, I thought that maybe he also needed someone who saw him as a person. I approached, talked, offered him a meal, and to my surprise, he smiled so big that it changed my day. It's incredible how such a simple gesture can make a difference." This type of report kept coming up. A young man, João, shared that he always saw a man selling sweets at the traffic lights near his work. He had never done more than give a few coins, but after reading what Clara had written, he decided to stop and talk to him. "I discovered that he was a worker all his life, but lost everything because of illness. Now he struggles to get something to eat every day." It was a quick conversation, but it made me realize how unpredictable life can be and how sometimes all people need is to be seen. A man named Bruno reported that, after reading her text, he had decided to spend time with a person he saw every day sleeping under a bridge. "I never imagined I could learn so much," he told me, about his childhood, about the dreams he had that were destroyed by a series of tragedies. "In the end, I realized that we have a lot more in common than I would have ever thought." These messages and stories made Clara feel like she had created something bigger than herself. What began as a simple act of compassion between her and Marcelo had now expanded into hundreds, perhaps thousands, of similar interactions. It was as if the human connection she had cultivated that day at the cafe was multiplying, turning into small flames of solidarity in different corners of the city. In turn, the positive reaction was not limited to reporting stories either. Some people, inspired by Clara's experience, began to organize collective actions. Volunteer groups emerged in some parts of São Paulo, organizing donations and mobilizations to help those who needed it most. A group of university students got together to distribute food in the city center, where the homeless population was larger. "This all started because we read your post," they wrote in a comment. "Now we do it every week and more people are joining us." While reading the countless reports, Clara felt immense gratitude for having made the decision to get involved in Marcelo's life that day. The impact that seemingly small gesture had made was immeasurable. More than that, she felt that the ripple effect her story had not only transformed the lives of those receiving help, but also deeply touched those offering it. A few days passed and Clara's routine continued, but now with a new purpose vibrating in her heart. The repercussions of her post still resonated on social media and in everyday conversations, and she felt that, in some way, she had contributed to an empathy movement that seemed to take on a life of its own. Even so, her mind often went back to that cafe, that meeting with Marcelo, and she wondered how he was doing. There was a lingering sense of worry, mixed with hope that the spark she helped ignite was still present in his life. On an ordinary day, as he was leaving the same cafe where it all started, something caught his attention. Sitting on a bench a few meters away, a familiar figure made her stop suddenly. Her heart accelerated and, for a moment, Clara remained motionless, as if she were trying to confirm what she saw. It was him, Marcelo. He was there. His presence, although still marked by an air of caution, seemed different. He was sitting more upright, his shoulders a little less hunched, as if an invisible weight had been slightly lifted. Unable to contain her emotion, Clara ran towards him, her steps hurried by the enthusiasm that was growing within her. "Hi, Marcelo," she exclaimed, her voice full of surprise and joy. Marcelo looked up, clearly surprised by the sudden approach. But as soon as his eyes met Clara's, a genuine smile formed on his face. "Hi, Clara," he replied. The softness in his voice was different from that first time. There was something more, something Clara couldn't help but notice. She sat next to him, without losing the smile on her face. "Are you well?" he asked expectantly. It was clear that Marcelo was different, and she couldn't wait to hear what he had to say. "I'm better, much better," replied Marcelo, with a calm tone that Clara hadn't heard before. "I heard about your post. It really helped me see things in a new way." Clara's heart overflowed with emotion upon knowing that her story, the impact of that meeting, had reached Marcelo back. It made her feel a wave of gratitude. The reunion was emotional, and she felt that there, at that moment, she was witnessing the beginning of a new phase in his life. "I'm so happy to hear that, Marcelo," she said. "You deserve to be seen, you deserve much more." Clara knew that, despite everything, he would still face many challenges. But every small step in the right direction was a victory. "You did this for yourself," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I only showed that you were never alone, but it was you who had the courage to take the next step." Marcelo's smile widened, but Clara could see that the emotion in that moment was deep. He looked relieved, as if he was finally allowing hope to rise within him without fear of it being crushed again. Indeed, there was a new confidence in his posture, the glow of optimism that was beginning to replace the darkness of before. "Now there is hope," she thought, and the joy she felt was impossible to hide. "I will support you in every step of this process," Clara said firmly. "You are no longer alone, and I know you will find your place, both at work and in your life." Although Clara had played a role in rekindling Marcelo's hope, he himself had seized that chance with all his might. Now he was determined to change his life, and Clara, by his side, was equally committed to supporting him on this new path. When saying goodbye that day, Clara felt something new inside her, like a feeling that she was participating in something bigger than herself. The repercussions of her post still resonated on social media and in everyday conversations, and she felt that, in some way, she had contributed to an empathy movement that seemed to take on a life of its own. Marcelo's life was changing, and she, along with him, had also been transformed. With one last smile, they promised to stay in touch, knowing that this friendship and mutual support would forever be a reminder that even in the most unlikely circumstances, solidarity and compassion would always find a way to flourish. By sharing her experience with the world, Clara not only honored Marcelo's struggle, but also spread a powerful message that we all have the potential to make a difference. Every gesture, no matter how small, had the power to change the world, one person and one heart at a time. Thus, the story of Clara and Marcelo remained alive, far beyond that coffee, far beyond the note he gave her, and far beyond the post that spread across social media. Clara learned that often the most powerful stories are hidden in the people we ignore, the ones we see on the streets, who seem invisible to the majority. They carry a complexity of feelings, struggles, and dreams that are rarely revealed. And when we choose to reach out, even for a brief moment, we can light a flame of hope in an almost extinguished heart. That's what happened to Marcelo. He, who previously found himself with no way out, with his life falling apart around him, found the strength to rebuild his path thanks to a simple gesture of kindness. His friendship with Clara not only gave him the courage to move forward, but it also made him realize that compassion still existed in the world and, more importantly, that he still had something to offer.